Today we're going to be starting our student learning objective. There are a few things that you're going to need to get ready. The first thing that you're going to need is the SLO planning template. You will need your process guide, some student data, and you'll also need your standards. You can find your standards, your process guide, and your planning template on the Educator Effectiveness TLC site. Please take a moment now to gather your data so that we can begin the SLO process. Okay, so now that you have your data, let's take a look at it. When I was doing my student learning objective, one of the things that I realized was that the data, the student learning objective actually evolves from the data. So we need to look at the data. We need to make sure that we have multiple sources that say the same thing. So as I considered mine, I thought about what the data told me about the skills that my students were at. And I had to come up with an assessment that it could be replicated 2 or 3 times throughout the year so I could target growth. As we consider the baseline data and the rationale for our student learning objective, assessments like Smarter Balance might come into mind. And although Smarter Balance is good for looking at trends and patterns, it may not be the best assessment to gauge student progress throughout the year. So I would recommend assessments such as PALS, MAPS, DIBELS, classroom assessment based on standards, authentic assessments, classroom assignments, things like that, that will allow you to gauge where the students are currently, what proficiency level are they currently, and where do you want them to go, and an assessment that will be able to track that progress. As I consider my data for my students, I noticed during the MAPS assessment that the students were really showing low proficiency scores on informational text and using informational text to support their opinions and ideas. Therefore, I did some pre-assessments just to make sure that the MAPS assessments and results were concurrent. That's the baseline data I'm choosing. I'm choosing my pre-assessments from the beginning of the year, supported with the evidence found on the MAPS test. So now that I know the area that my students are needing extra support in, I have to consider, do those areas reflect the standards that I'm supposed to be teaching my students? So as I think about that, I'm a 6th grade English teacher. I would use the Common Core State Standards. We would use the appropriate standards for the grade level and the subject area in which we teach. For 6th grade, citing evidence to support opinions or ideas is actually a standard, and that is the standard that is aligned then to my data. I will use that standard for my student learning objective. So now that we've considered our baseline data and our rationale, and we've aligned it to our standard for our content area, our grade level, now we need to consider the student population that the data states needs that support. So for my analysis, when I looked at my MAP score and my pre-assessments, I found that 80% of my students needed more support in providing informational text to support their ideas and their opinions. Therefore, that 80% of the students will be my target population. Your target population does not have to consist of your whole class. However, there should be a solid rationale as to why you're selecting a subgroup. The next step in writing our student learning objective is to consider the interval. The interval is the time that you have that student or that group of students within a school year. For example, elementary teachers have their students from September to June, so their interval will be for the entire year. If you are a middle school teacher or a high school teacher and you have your students for 1 semester or 1 term, that is your interval. Decide what interval you have for your student population and jot that down now. now that I know what students that I'm going to be targeting for my student learning objective, I should consider the growth that I'm expecting of my students. So I can consider two models. There's the attainment model, which stipulates that regardless of where the students started in the beginning of the year, they're all going to end up at the same level. Or I can look at a growth model, which states no matter where they started, they're all going to grow and continue growing. If I have an attainment model, and I state that all my students will meet proficiency, the students that are at proficient or at basic may not need to grow very much, where the students that are at a minimum level may have a long way to go. However, on the other hand, if I use a growth model and I say all the students will grow at least one proficiency level, then all my students have the opportunity to show growth regardless of the proficiency level that they started at. Consider your target growth for your student population. Along with the benchmark assessments that we have determined we're going to use for the beginning, the interval, and the end of the year assessments, we also should consider formative assessments and other evidence sources that we will use throughout the year to help us decide on student progress and help us consider whether we need to shift or change or be flexible in our instruction and our strategies. I will use, as I consider my students, quizzes, classroom assessments, running records, their portfolios for 6th grade. I also want to make sure that my assessments are objective and that they're using specific rubrics that can gauge the students and to help me understand where the students are struggling with and where the students are meeting progress. Okay, so now we're almost at the end. We've talked about our baseline data. We've talked about how it aligns to our standards and our for our grade level and our content. We discussed the student population. What is our group of students that we're going to be working with? And what is the growth that we're looking for? And for how long are we going to be working with these students? So now it's just a matter of taking that information and making a SMART goal out of it. So remember, SMART needs to be specific, needs to be measurable, attainable, it needs to be results-based, and time-bound. So with that, I'm going to give you an example of a SMART goal. For example, by May of 2015, 16 of my 32 students, or 50% of my students, will improve at least one writing proficiency as determined by the district's 6th grade writing rubric as they focus on supporting ideas with evidence from informational text. All right, so now that we've identified the academic goal for our students, we should consider the instructional strategies that we will be using throughout the year. For example, if flex grouping is something that you're interested in using, you've used it in the past, consider at this point what has worked, what hasn't worked. How will you implement it for your student population that you've chosen for your student learning objective? For my group, for example, I want the students to be able to read, reflect on what they read, offer an opinion, have a discussion, and actually use what they read to support their ideas and their opinions. To do that, I would like to use writing circles. So congratulations, you have completed your student learning objective. If you need any more support, please feel free to contact your school support teacher or the EE office. Thank you.